Hey, free-to-play gang, welcome back to another video. I'm gonna warn you first, this video is gonna be very technical, but that is just for the first part of this video. But I will still prefer if you watch the whole of the entire video, because that's gonna give you all the information you need in order for you to decide whether you want to have Leora or not. So, the reason why the title says that Leora is going to be the next Gaius, and I'm not trying to hype shit up for no reason, in fact, my stance on Leora is probably either R0 or just skip. But yet at the same time, I do believe that she is possibly even better than Gaius right now in terms of her damage. And let's check out why this is the case. So in order for us to proceed, I have done some math here, like actual literal math, in order for us to understand why she's so strong. We need to do a lot of calculations because her kit has a lot of numbers riddled into it. So not her first skill, but because of the War Goddess effect here, you know, the damage amplification that she has from the War Goddess mostly. But of course, on top of that, there's like a lot of multipliers, a lot of multi-hits, and of course the crit rate down as well, which we need to take into consideration. And yeah, just a lot of good stuff in her kit. But for this video, I think we just want to primarily focus more on the damage for the first part of this video. And then for the second part of this video, I'm just going to give some of my own opinions and some of the opinions that I shared with Tiger as well. If you do not know who Tiger is, I'll put a link down in the descriptions for you. You can go ahead and check out his live stream that he did like a couple of days ago. And that should give you an idea of why we have certain feelings about Leora right now. Okay, so let's start off with her buff. Okay, as you can see on this Excel spreadsheet, we have War Goddess. Now, we are not going to read the whole thing. If you want to, you can pause the video. But I'm just going to break it down into the most important points, which is number one, the greater the crit rate gap, the more damage we deal. Right? So this is very important. So it is essential that your Leora has 100% crit rate at all times. Be it either from buffs, either from your leader buff, or just having a natural 100% crit rate. That is super important. So for example, my Leora here has just nice 100%, which is very important. And now, point number two, grants a shield before allies take critical hits. That's the second part of her passive, or rather the second part of her buff. And this is something that we need to test out as well. Maybe we can just quickly test it out over here. Now, I do not know for a fact how much her shield is, but what I can say is it is ridiculously little. I think GG Easy covered this topic and he said it's about 20% of her attack, which is nonsense because I was expecting at least like 200%. And that's not the case. Okay, come on, crit me, come on, crit me. Oh my god, they didn't want to crit me. Okay, we're gonna have to do this again. And the reason why they're not critting is because their crit rate is only at 10%. Yeah, so just take note that all these enemies have 10% crit rate. Okay, so there you go. That is the shield. Can you see that? That little shit is the shield. And it lasts for one turn. Okay, but that shield is supposed to be about 20% of her attack, which is nonsense. I was expecting something like 200%. If not, it is frankly quite useless, which is part of the reason why I feel like Leora is either a really big skip for you, or at most just R0, not R6 material. But we'll talk about that later on. Okay, so let's move on to the next part. Now this is the Sear Test, and I needed to do this so that I can prove that landing a Sear on her first skill does not actually affect her DPS in her first skill. So her first skill does the damage first before landing the Sear. And the reason why I need to showcase this is so that later you guys don't say, but then in free-to-play, what about the Sear effect that you landed? Isn't that going to affect her damage output? Yeah, that is not going to be part of the damage calculation, which is why I had all the screenshots here showing you that sometimes I have Sear effects and all that. And that brings us to the next point, which is the damage amplification test. So we are actually trying to figure out what the damage amplification is from her War Goddess buff. So on one hand, we have the War Goddess buff, and on the other hand, we do not have the War Goddess buff. So when we have 100% crit rate difference, and how I achieved this is I just lowered their crit rate with our third skill here, which applies the crit rate down debuff. And on top of that, we already have 100% crit rate, and the enemy has a natural 10% crit rate. So they have like typically negative 20%, but that does not happen. So it goes down to 0%. So with 100% crit rate difference, our damage amplification is actually just nice on the dot, 1.6. So 60% difference basically. And if you lowered our crit rate by 10%, our damage amplification is now 1.57. And if we lower it to 70%, our damage amplification is 1.51. But I think I made a mistake here. I'm not sure why. So don't pay too much attention to this number. This number is probably going to be wrong. And then lower it down to 40% and we get 1.42 down and down. And I only stopped at 30%. I didn't want to go all the way down to 0% because I will need to have 10% crit rate and I still have to land a crit at the same time. I'm not going to do that test, okay? I'm just going to use math to do the test for me. So for the math heads out there, you guys are going to understand what's happening here, alright? So there is an issue here, right? As you can see, there is a little lump Like what happens when you're a 10-year-old watching Britney Spears MTV for the first time, right? Something grows a little bit inside. I want to figure out whether this bump is legit or not, or was it a mistake. So this number here is definitely wrong. So I've gone ahead to prove it. And the way I did it is I used the first point and the last point, and I just calculate what the slope of this curve is supposed to be, right? Is it even a curve or is it a straight line? So I assume that it's a straight line, and this is just an erroneous point. And then I went ahead to find the c, which is your mx plus c basically. And now we have the interpolated line. So this is going to be like our testing line, which is y equals to mx plus c, or y equals to 0.3 times x plus 1.3. And your y is obviously your damage amplification, and your x is obviously your crit rate difference. That's about it. So I then proceeded to do some stress testing, right, to make sure that this graph actually makes sense and that we are actually looking at a linear line and not an actual curve. And what I found out is that if I set y, which is your damage amplification, to be 1.51, our crit rate difference is actually supposed to be 0.7, which is true. So over here, right, something like that, if my y is 1.51, our crit difference should be 70%. And I did the same test for y equals to 1.42 and x is actually equals to 0.4, which is also correct, which means that this is supposed to fall on a straight line. That's about it. Which means that if there is no crit rate difference at all, so you have the same crit as the enemy, you're instantly going to have an additional 30% damage amplification. That is what I'm trying to find out here. But this line is actually going to be very important because it's going to aid us in the calculation of other numbers in her second and her third skill as well. Alright, so that's it for her buff. That is exactly how it works. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave it down in the comment section below. But anyway, this is the line that you need to know in case you want to calculate stuff. But I know you guys are probably not going to care. Okay, anyway, so this is her second skill, Dawn Guardian. I'm not going to read the whole skill for you, but I'm just going to give you the main pointers. And this is the part where Tiger actually raised in his live stream. And this is very helpful as well. So pointer number 1, applies War Goddess before attacking. Alright, so her second skill will always have the effect of War Goddess, because when she uses it, she's instantly going to go into the War Goddess buff, right? Make sense? So she always has damage amplification on this skill, which means we need to include this amount into her final damage amount. Now we're also going to assume that you have 4 other surviving allies, because each surviving ally excluding herself grants 10% damage for a grand total of 40%. So that's going to add to our final damage as well. And this is not an additional attack, I think. This is probably a final damage multiplier. Because here they say grants plus 10% damage, not grants plus 10% attack of damage or something like that. It just says damage. So I'm going to take it as a final damage multiplier, which means your final damage on your second skill is somewhere, right, depending on how far apart your crit rate is from the enemy, it's either as low as, and I say low, 327.6% or 403.2% if you have a 100% crit rate difference with the enemy. So this skill is going to slaughter a lot of tanks, or rather, it's going to slaughter a lot of support espers, because you're probably going to have a 100% crit rate difference, especially when you can use the crit rate down debuff that happens on your third skill. So your single target nuke is a 403% extreme nuke. Or if you're hitting someone who has the same crit rate, right, 100%, same as you, you're gonna deal 327.6% damage. This is gonna one-shot any DPS at all. There is no DPS in the world who can survive a 327% nuke. No way, not a chance. So her second skill is actually extremely freaking powerful. I've never seen a skill that hits so hard. Like this skill, in most cases, for this to even happen, that requires the enemy to have, like, let's say, a lot of debuffs so that the multiplier goes up like crazy. But this is not the case. This skill in itself, right, just because of how War Goddess applies with Dawn Guardian itself, oh my goodness, this skill is so freaking powerful. Now let's move on to her third skill, Daylight Beam. Same thing, she applies War Goddess before casting this ability, so this skill will always have the damage amplification inbuilt into it. It's always going to be part of this skill. Not even Buff Blocker can prevent this Golden Rim buff from happening. Her War Goddess is unstoppable, you cannot prevent it at all. Now, pointer number 2, crit rate down coming from this effect actually increases your damage output by 39%, because you're going to increase the gap between you and the enemy by 30% from whatever gap that was in the first place, and that's going to increase by an additive 39%. So your final damage on that one target that you're targeting, because this has 2 stages in its attacks. The first stage is a single target nuke, and the second stage is an AoE sweep or something like that. So your single target final damage lies somewhere in between 221% to 272%, and the AoE damage that you deal, not including the single target here, so it's like the rest of the enemies, they take somewhere between 156% to 192% AoE damage. This is insanely strong. This is so freaking powerful. And just to give you guys an idea of how powerful this is, Gaius God King S2, his Thunder Judgment, has a 150% multiplier, fixed. 150% multiplier, that's it. The bare minimum damage that you will deal on your AoE damage is 156%. It's already more damage than Gaius at his max form, like his maxed out status. Of course, it's easier to build Gaius because he don't need crit rate, so you should also take that into consideration, right? But for the most part, what the hell, dude? Her AoE damage is bigger than Gaius, and on top of that, she also has more damage on a single target So all in all, believe it or not, Leora is by far probably one of the best espers that we can hope for right now. Like, her damage output is insane. She only needs to be at R0. She don't need to be at R2, she don't need to be at R4 or R6. None of those even matters. And the reason why she don't need to be at R6, like I said, all of her S2 and S3, they will always apply the War Goddess, so you don't need to have perpetual War Goddess. Okay, if you guys want to understand what I'm talking about, let's take a look at her resonances again. So if you take a look at her R6, right, what this does is it just gives you War Goddess perpetually, but the thing is you do not need it perpetually because your second and your third skills are always going to land the War Goddess buff, so you do not need this at all. And on top of that, because of how little the shield effect is on her War Goddess buff, right, it's like 20% of her attack. It's so redundant. It doesn't even matter. You don't even need it at the start. It's not going to protect your allies at all. 20% is nothing. It's like what, a 400 HP shield? No thanks, dude. If I'm going to be receiving a crit, I'm going to be taking like 30,000 damage. That 500 is like nothing. So going by this, she is not R6, and she's definitely not R4 because this has a cap of 45%. It doesn't go on like endlessly. So she's not going to be scaling to the moon, for example. And her R2, this is so freaking useless. It cannot be resisted upon a critical hit. Like, it's good to have, but it's definitely not necessary at all. So I do feel like her being at R0 is probably like a good place to stop. Or if you want to, you can go to R5 just because of the stats. But apart from that, it doesn't make sense to go R6, I think. Not at this current point in time. I think the devs really need to work on the shield. I think the shield needs to go up to at least, okay, I'm gonna be a little bit more generous here. It needs to be at least 100% of her attack. So what does this mean moving forward, right? So the thing is, she is potentially, and I say potentially, I cannot test this, so I cannot confirm it just yet, but she's potentially necessary for Chronos, like much faster Chronos runs, like the Ultimate Spire, for example. So it is not a surprise that they reintroduce a new club feature that promotes the Ultimate Spire, because she is probably going to be necessary in speed running Chronos. And the reason why this is the case is because her third skill, let's not forget that she grants herself an attack buff. So she's able to use her third skill, AoE nuke, all the waves, wave 1 and wave 2. She probably can one-shot these waves because of how much damage output she has. And of course, on top of that, she resets her skills on her first skill, right? So at the start of combat, at the start of each wave, basically, you reset all of her skill cooldowns. And on top of that, she also has the attack lead, which is like insane for Chronos, or at least insane for like speedrunning Chronos. And the best part of her kit is that she, oh my god, and the best part of her kit is that she does not need any skill ups at all, because the skill ups only increases her damage, right? See that? It only increases the damage, it doesn't increase anything else. I mean, yes, it does reduce her cooldown, but then again, she has her first skill that already resets her skill cooldown, so there is really no point in giving her skill ups, there's really no point in giving her more resonances, so she's strictly an R0 Esper that's gonna perform really freaking well. Especially in Chronos, you know, like I said, right, so she gives herself the attack up buff for 2 turns. And of course, I didn't even talk about the rest of her other kits. Like, she gains invincibility for 2 turns on her third skill, which is excellent for Chronos. And of course, on top of that, she grants standoff to the rest of your team, and even up to 2 turns as well. This is like super broken. I've tested this out. You know what, let's just give this a go. Let's take a look at how powerful her second skill is. Let's reduce our HP down to below 50%. Alright, check this out, check this out. Okay, so I'm below 50% HP. I'm gonna use this skill, right? My second skill. So it's gonna grant myself 2 turns of standoff and any of my allies who are below 50% as well. But Unas is at 100%, so he only gets 1 turn. I have 2 turns of standoff. It's insane. Like, she has 1 skill that grants her 2 turns of invincibility. She has another skill that grants your allies, all your allies, potentially 2 turns of standoff. That is a lot of support, so I do feel like she has a very interesting kit, and she has a lot of potential value in this game as well, which is what makes me feel like she is definitely a must-get. Now, as for the reason why I say that she's possibly a skip for you, potentially, it's because of her typing, right? So she's naturally not good in PvP because the current meta is just generally wind types, and she is gonna suck a little bit there. And her shields are worth like next to nothing, so in that sense, she's not gonna perform really well, although she does carry like the invincibilities and the standoff, which is very helpful. And I'm just thinking about the content where she would shine in right now. So she's definitely gonna shine in the tower content, Calamity Island as well. She's also gonna shine in Chronos, but I'm thinking about the other content in the game. Like, if you have all these stuff settled, do you necessarily need another copy of Leora? That really depends. But the thing is, if you are still struggling with this content, then yes, she's definitely going to be very powerful for you, and especially for new players as well. She is definitely indispensable for new players trying to get Chrono 16 early on. The 2 turns invincibility, I'm repeating myself, and the 2 turns standoff, holy crap. Okay, and as I'm editing the video, there is also one more reason why I feel like she is also a skip. And that is if you already have a Gaius. Yes, Gaius, she does kind of outshine him in some cases, but he still multi-hits as well. And he's able to take down single targets very effectively. So he still has that niche, right, like I talked about earlier on. But on top of that, if you already had a Gaius, then what's the point of getting Leora as well? Because you already have him that is fitting that role. And on top of that, if Gaius is at R2, he's gonna grant the rest of your DPS as plus 20% crit rate. And that is going to help you maximize the damage output as well. And of course, on top of that, the main reason why Gaius is so strong is because he's super easy to build. You do not need to invest any crit rate into him. You can just go full crit damage and he's going to shine like a diamond. Yeah, so my thinking is if you already had a Gaius, there's very little reason why you want to get an extra copy of like Leora, for example. I don't think she's going to bring a lot to the table. Aside from the fact that Gaius takes 2 turns to transform, right? And Leora only takes 1 turn because she's just going to nuke. That's it. But anyway, that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to thumbs up. It really helps the channel, and subscribe for more Dislyte content. Now with that said, this has been Derry Free to Play, and as always, I will see you in the next video.